Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the huge and fast-growing trade tensions between two economic giants, India and the United States. And you know what? It really all comes down to one single, very big number. 50%. That's the tariff wall the U.S. basically threw up overnight against a whole bunch of Indian goods. And it sent these massive shockwaves through what is a really critical global trade relationship. So believe me, this isn't just a number. It's pretty much a declaration of a whole new economic reality.
Right, so how in the world does a number like 50% even happen? Let's get into it and unpack the story behind this really high-stakes problem. So here's the first thing you need to know. This massive tariff, it wasn't just a single move. It was actually two separate 25% hits that were imposed in the same month, August 2025. You add those together, and boom, you've created this enormous hurdle for Indian companies trying to sell into the U.S. market.
Okay, so to really get a handle on why this happened, we've got to look at the chain of events that led up to this standoff. And it's a story where, policy, pressure, and global politics all kind of collide. And I mean, this all happened so fast. It really started back in April with this announcement of a new reciprocal trade idea. But by August, it was a full-blown crisis. You had this 1-2 punch of tariffs hitting Indian exporters just weeks apart.
So the U.S. administration basically gave two main reasons for all of this. That first 25%, that was part of a bigger push for what it was calling reciprocal tariffs, trying to balance out trade. But the second 25%, that was a straight-up penalty, and they specifically pointed to India's decision to keep buying crude oil from Russia.
And the White House wasn't exactly quiet about it. The policy was rolled out with a really clear, really emphatic message. This post from Donald Trump on Truth Social just highlights the administration's public position, that this was all about fundamentally changing trade policy to benefit the U.S.
So what happens when a 50% tariff wall just goes up pretty much overnight? Let's dig into the actual real-world consequences for Indian industries on the ground.
The impact was, immediate and really clear. The data from the Trade Ministry showed that in just 1 month, from July to August, India's exports to the U.S. just plummeted. We're talking by over $1 billion. It was a 9-month low. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, when you look at the competitive landscape. See, a 50% tariff doesn't just make your stuff more expensive. It puts Indian exporters at this huge disadvantage compared to their main rivals in the region, like Vietnam and China, who are facing much lower U.S. tariffs.
And this table, wow, this really shows you the cost on the ground. When you stack that new 50% tariff on top of the rates that already existed, the effective tax on some goods just becomes astronomical. I mean, look at knitted apparel. It went from under 14% to nearly 64%. That is an absolute game changer for any business.
And you have to understand, these tariffs weren't random, they were targeted. They hit some of India's most important labor-intensive export sectors, industries like textiles, seafood, and jewelry. I mean, these places employ millions of people, and suddenly their biggest market became incredibly expensive to get into.
But, and this is a really important but, you have to look at what wasn't hit. Key strategic sectors like pharma, smartphones, and petroleum products were actually exempt. And that was a huge deal because it cushioned the blow, preventing the economic shock from being even worse and protecting over $24 billion in exports.
And just as you'd expect, industry groups in India started sounding the alarm right away. The Federation of Indian Export Organizations called it a serious setback. They actually calculated that these tariffs created a massive 30 to 35% cost disadvantage compared to their competitors.
And this is where it gets really tough, because we're not just talking about huge multinational companies here. These tariffs are a massive threat to India's giant network of micro, small, and medium-sized businesses. These smaller outfits, they are the absolute backbone of the export economy, and they're the ones who are most vulnerable to these kinds of sudden price shocks.
So you're faced with this immense economic pressure. What do? How does a country respond? Well, India has basically rolled out a multi-part strategy to try and navigate this crisis.
It's essentially a two-track play. On one hand, you've got them keeping the diplomatic channels open with Washington, trying to find a way to talk this out. But at the exact same time, they're hitting the gas on building stronger trade relationships everywhere else, trying to rely less and less on the American market.
And hey, there are some small signs that the talking part might be working. Despite all the tension, high-level talks are back on the schedule. The announcement that the U.S. Trade Representative is going to visit, it offers a little glimmer of hope for a diplomatic solution.
And that other part of the plan, diversification, it is not just talk.
India is aggressively redrawing its own trade map. They've already signed a landmark free trade deal with the UK, they're getting deeper with blocs like BRICS, and they're actively looking for new markets everywhere from Europe to Latin America.
So, where does all this leave India? Well, it's a really tricky spot. The road ahead is anything but certain. It's an incredibly delicate, high-stakes balancing act.
Look, this is so much more than just a trade dispute. It's really a complex geopolitical test. India now has to juggle all of this at once, protect its key industries at home, manage this vital but super strained relationship with the US, and build totally new alliances.
But, and this is a really important but, we need some perspective here. While these tariffs are incredibly painful for specific industries, India's economy as a whole is actually somewhat insulated. That's because exports to the US only make up about 2% of India's total GDP, so the hit to the overall economy is limited, and that gives the country a little bit of breathing room.
And that brings us to the big, final question. The U.S. has built this massive tariff wall. The entire future of this critical economic partnership now really hinges on one thing. Can India's dual strategy of talking it out and branching out actually build a bridge to get over that wall? The answer to that is going to redefine global trade for years to come.